We now come up to our next session. We're going to talk about going global, the challenge of ensuring consistency in medical communications around the world. Please welcome to the stage Bryce McMurrary and Christine van der Linden.
Well, it will be just Bryce.
Bryce first.
Thank you. Right. This presentation is a little bit of, I have to admit, a personal reflection on a few issues to do with where we are, where we've been, and where we're going, and how that applies to the broader world. Apologies if you were at the MWA meeting last November in Den Haag, because this is basically the same presentation that I presented there, with a few tweaks and additions. But it's a topic that's kind of struck me, because last year I realized that I'd been working in medical publications for 20 years, having come from clinical research, working in CRO and within a pharma company, and then before that in academic research. And it was an interesting point to reflect on how much had changed and how we got to where we were. So, Clark et al., as part of the MPIP initiative, published this paper in International Journal of Clinical Practice in 2010, which talked about the evolution of organization standards and so on in this whole area of good publication practice. So, as you can see here, I didn't know this until I saw this paper. AMWA, the American Medical Writers Association, actually formed way back in 1940. Vancouver group, ICMGE, started in '78, and then we sort of see the evolution through the '80s with the European Association of Science Editors, European Medical Writers Association, WAME, the World Association of Medical Editors in '95. And then really in the millennial period, you see the start of where we are today with the formation of ISMAP in 2005 and MPIP in 2008. So various stages here, but as I say, going back to very early concepts and ideas about medical publishing in those early societies, 1970s and before. The guidelines started again after the formation of the Vancouver group, which became ICMJE in 1979, and then a big gap really until 97, uniform requirements get updated, and then GPP really starting in 2003. You can see then the various different organizations like MWA and Pharma starting to produce guidelines, and then we get more updates. The one thing that was missing from here, because this was actually, I did these slides pre-GPP3, was GPP3 obviously being published last year. And then, continuing initiatives as we go through the decades as well. The AMWA Medical Writer Task Force started in 2001. You've got FDAR and ICMJE initiatives in 2007. That's really the place where rules around what to publish and when to publish it start getting earnest. Positions from the various manufacturers association, you can see there, codes of ethics, principles for responsible clinical trial data reporting from the industry organizations, and so on. So it's been an evolving landscape in terms of the different initiatives coming from various different bodies. But I think if we look at the reasons behind all of this, it's all to do with scrutiny. Everything was really triggered by a number of different scandals, a number of different things that investigative journalists looked at. But I think what we've been sort of suffering from, and this came up a little bit in some of the discussions today, there's a whole legacy of these old studies, these old cases where things were not done in the way they were in the past. And what I see when you often find reports in the lay press about our industry and so on is that they look backwards. They look back to the 1990s and so on. There's one of the jobs I think we've still got to do is get the recognition that things have changed and get that message across about the fact that now things are done completely differently. So what changes have we seen? And again, this was a sort of personal reflection of coming into the industry in 1995 and thinking about the first programs that I was involved in, not really knowing anything about this area. It was interesting, though, thinking back to my career before I came into medical publishing. As I say, I worked in a CRO for a while. And one of my jobs at that stage, I was quite young at that point, and this was in the early 90s when computers were just becoming widely used. And being still in my 20s then, I was, one of the people who could actually operate them. And one of the roles I was given was investigator meetings to present progress on the trial and sometimes data that had been prepared by a statistician and so on. And I always used to remember at these meetings that if a study was looking very positive, if the results looked good, as you got to the end of it, there'd be some discussion with the sponsor and the investigators about should we publish it. If a study wasn't positive, there was always this, oh, it's not worth publishing. And I think there was an assumption that that's, oh, we're trying to hide this data. It's not really the case. People just want to be associated with positive results. They get more excited about that. So I suppose in a certain sort of way, obviously I was in a junior position in those days, you feel sort of complicit. But again, there was no real conspiracy. It was simply, oh, well, we're only interested in publishing things that show, a positive result simply because that's what people are interested in. So again, it's not always the case that, it was malice aforethought. When I started in medical publications in '95, and was introduced to the clients, pretty much exclusively all worked in the marketing departments. Didn't really think, again, that there was anything particularly odd about that. Many of them were medical doctors and PhDs and so on, and you didn't really feel that there was any sort of anything sinister about that, but that was the case. Obviously now, as we saw this morning, most of your groups reporting into medical affairs or clinical development in one or two cases. So that's changed completely. We used to talk a lot, I remember, about key messages. So the key clinical properties of a new product, how it would benefit patients, its safety profile, and so on, distilled down into these so-called key messages. Again, at the time, didn't think much of it. Everybody talked about it. That was the way it was discussed. Now we have refined the language to talk about clinical statements, so things that can be said to be factually true about the drug based on the clinical data. So the language is changing. And in fact, one initiative I've been involved in from ISMAP was an agency forum where we started to discuss a glossary of terms, of preferred terms for describing medical publications, and the whole process is involved. So this whole notion of what language you use to describe things is very important now. People are very sensitive. As I said, with my experience in CRO, it was all about publishing the best, and as we've just seen, all about now publishing everything, or everything that's practically possible to publish. And we would work with our sponsors back in those days very closely with them, with the authors, often the lead investigators and so on. But there was no disclosure in the papers that we'd been involved at all. Again, we would work with physicians who'd been involved in the studies and other people. They didn't really think that there was anything untoward about what we were doing. They just viewed it as a set of experts on medical writing that were coming to help them with this and make sure things were got done in time. And there was no disclosure. Obviously now our involvement is disclosed. So to a certain extent we can be open about the programs that we work on and so on. So it was kind of interesting to think back as to how it was then and how it is now and how it's evolving. I think, though, again, the point was that if you read the articles in the press and so on, you will think that it was always about trying to hide something. In my experience, I can honestly say I was never really involved in that. It was, where things went wrong, it was just because people didn't really think about the perceptions and so forth. The number of cases where there was a deliberate attempt to hide something were generally few and far between. It was just a way of doing things and a set of values that hadn't really received that scrutiny. So, interesting to think about how things have changed. But I think looking at all of those standards and bodies and so forth, and going to meetings like this and listening to the audience, one of the things that often strikes me is that we have a very narrow pool of people who are getting up and professing to be experts about this, in the sense that if you looked at the number of people from the US, from the UK, and the Western European countries talking about this, there's a great many. But clinical research and drug development goes on around the world. Drugs are launched in all sorts of different regions and territories. One of the challenges is, how do we make all of these practices really global, so that a piece of research done in Shanghai could have the same assurances around how it's communicated as a piece of research done in the United States or Europe. Now, the dots on this map indicate the locations of the Springer healthcare offices where we're actively involved in medical publications in some form or another. And some of the things that I'm going to talk about now are based on experience of working with some of our regional offices and some of their perceptions and views on and what they find in their markets going on. So, as I said, most initiatives are driven from US, UK, and Northern Europe. I think we accept that. And we do see some countries rapidly taking up best practices. I'll talk a little bit about Japan shortly. That's a good example of a place where, if you go back 5 years or so, there was limited knowledge of this whole area, but we've seen a dramatic acceleration in that. There are other parts of the world, again, which I'll come on to in a minute, where we do see very limited penetration of understanding of best practices. And there is still a great deal of need for education in different parts of the world. And I think one of the challenges is how we best approach that education. Because I think there have been a couple of things here that maybe we could do better. One of the things I had a look at as part of this thinking about the true globalization was looked at the ISMAT membership. If you're an ISMAT member, as I'm sure most of you are, you can go onto the database of members and you can do a query on countries and see how many members belong to which countries. And I guess not unsurprisingly, you find that nearly half the membership is from the United States. Then almost another quarter from the United Kingdom. And then next country down, surprisingly, here we are, Switzerland. And then other Western European or westernized countries, India quite represented. But obviously the key message here is that once you take those big blocks out, it's a very small slices of pie there in all those different countries. The other grey one, incidentally, is unknown. For whatever reason, they hadn't included a country on their profile. So it struck me that the whole debate, the whole discussion was, for want of a better description, a little bit Anglo-centric, a little bit centred on the Western European countries. Not surprising, because a lot of the drug industry is obviously originally based there, but you know, the new products and new markets and so on are increasingly important, and a lot of research going on, particularly in Asian countries and so on. How do we get this understanding, this concordance on what best practice is, driven more into those markets as well? So started me thinking about that. So what do we see around the world in different locations? Thinking about Europe to start with, I'd say generally there's good awareness of good practice, but there is quite a bit of variation between countries. What we see, for instance, in our Spanish and Italian businesses, is that for authors, investigators in those regions, until recently there's been far less awareness of what good practice is. Taking the example of Spain, for instance, there were one of the things I noticed that was when authors would talk about the issues of authorship and the process that they needed to go through to make sure that they were standing by the research and the true definition of authors that we heard before, was that their perception was that you shouldn't have to do all of these things, that they had, on a sort of contextual basis, worked with the sponsor, and the sponsor trusted them implicitly, and they were trusted by the sponsor. So they almost felt that creating this trail was a little bit unnecessary and a little bit demeaning. So we actually did have people, authors for whom had that attitude. And then, we had to go through the process of educating them really about why this was an issue and all the sorts of things that could happen. But again, there was almost like a slightly different cultural perception of why you would do this. They saw it as a little bit, everything's based on personal trust. So what that told me was that there are cultural issues, cultural backgrounds that you've got to be a little bit sensitive to when you start discussing this with some of these countries. For somebody who's not really encountered all the regulations before, which might be an investigator or author you'd not worked with before, and then all of a sudden they're thrust into this arena. So after a while, they began to understand it, and it was really around the fact that you're working on an international stage, you're publishing in an English language journal, and you have to take your time to explain it all. We are seeing, as in our work around Europe now, the emergence of local publication managers. One company in particular, we've got one in Italy now, for instance, dealing with this. And I think that this we started to talk about earlier on, about how the regional groups, the affiliate companies, work with the headquarters and what the different structures and approaches are. But that's something we're seeing certainly, and I'd say the southern European countries are sort of leading that really as for those markets. Japan, I talked about before. One of the things I was working on last year, a little bit before that, was launching the inScience group within Springer Healthcare in Japan. And what they have seen is a tremendous growth in local medical affairs in the various different companies over the last several years. Again, the changes that I was talking about between 1995 and 2015 that took place in Western countries, that's been taking place in Japan, but sort of moved on 10 years. But it has been a very rapid change as companies have changed their structure and moved publications and those related activities, scientific communication, into the medical affairs group away from marketing. They also, for any of you that know the Japanese market, you'll be aware of this, they had a big tightening of the voluntary promotional code at the beginning of 2015, which has led a lot of companies to change their practices. Everything is now emphasizing scientific discussion. A lot of promotion has ceased. One of the things that they used to do a lot in the Japanese market was provide bulleted Japanese summaries of articles written in English. Problem with that approach sometimes was that it was felt that the tone of the summary wasn't entirely accurate, maybe didn't reflect everything. So companies have moved away somewhat from that as an aid to promotion, as an aid to discussion with doctors, and are trying to focus more on the original English language paper and the whole science behind that. And I think obviously that's produced quite a few challenges in that regard. What you do see in Japan, and again it's been a leader in the Asian countries I think on this, is this real demand to educate physicians on international practices. So we've got a few pictures later on that show some of the seminars that we've been doing, but it's something you see huge demand for out there at the moment. China, as I'm sure you know, massive interest from authors and sponsoring companies. When as a head of a medical communications agencies, you go and talk to a new company, a new pharmaceutical company that you've maybe not worked with before. One of the questions that we frequently get is, what are you doing in China? Can you support us and help us there? Because we have enormous expansion plans. As you know, there are financial incentives for academics to publish in English language journals, quite sizable sums of money, which has the effect sometimes of distorting the market for this. And I'm sure you're aware, there have been a number of scandals in China to do with research generally. It's a hyper-competitive environment. Everybody's trying to publish, everybody's trying to get involved. But again, there's a and big demand for education about the right way to do things to maximize your chances of getting accepted to a prestigious Western journal. But somewhat behind Japan in terms of understanding of those things and how they're applied in practice. Working with Chinese authors can obviously be challenging because of the language difficulty. So what you tend to find is you're trying to produce an English language article with a sponsor involvement, and typically the sponsor has people who speak Chinese and English, and then you have the authors who probably don't speak much English, and you're trying to work with a medical writer, say in the UK, to get that all written up in English and follow good publication practice, which means obviously the author has to be involved at every stage. So it's a very lengthy backwards and forwards process at times to do that, but you have to emphasize that this is absolutely necessary for a paper to be compliant. Latin America is probably one of the most challenging areas, I think, based on our experience. Payment of authors is still considered acceptable, and this is probably the one area in a number of countries there where you have this. If I'm going to write this or be involved in it, I want payment for that activity, independently of any other research activity that I may have been involved in. So again, educating on that and finding ways that people are being involved but not actually being paid to be authors is a challenge. One of the things that you hear about is there's a slightly different perception of academic medicine in some Latin American countries. They tend to value practice, the size of their practice, far more than being involved in research and producing academic papers. It doesn't have the same cachet that it does in Western countries. So that in and of itself just changes the whole environment. It's not, things aren't quite seen in the same way. And from talking to my colleagues there in Brazil and Mexico and Argentina, there's very little awareness of good publication practice and the ideas behind it. It's it's starting. You are starting to see pockets of it, of people going out there and starting to do seminars and so on. But you ask them and they say, oh well, there's no real understanding here. If an author said, oh, I just want to put my name to that paper and so on, and was presented with it, a lot of authors would still do that and not perceive that there was anything wrong with it. So this is an area where there's a big need for education, and by their own admission, the people involved in medical publishing there do say that it's a long way behind. So this kind of brings us on to the question of how can you be global and at the same time operate in local markets. This is an example of a seminar that we did in Japan last year. One thing that worked very well for us on a couple of these things that we've done is the simultaneous translation. So those of you, I'm sure many of you have been to meetings in Japan and elsewhere where you have the translation booth at the back and you wear your headset and so forth. What that allows you to do is have a mixture of Japanese presenters and English presenters, and you get they're translating the whole thing as it goes, and you're able to sort of get across to the audience for whom English is not their first language these more complex ideas. So we found that what tends to happen if you do a talk purely in English, even trying to make it as slow and as simple as possible, in all honesty, the audience probably picks up 20 or 30% of it. If you do it with the translation, they get much more out of it. So wherever you're doing an event like this, my advice is to pay the extra and do that. Don't assume that everybody's English is good enough to really absorb this. Obviously, in cultures like that, they won't necessarily admit to that or say to that, but try and make it as easy as possible. And I think this is a continuing theme that you really have to make that effort to get the message across in local language. This is another example here. As you can see, we're doing a mixture of English and Japanese on the presentation there. Because I think one of the things that tends to happen is we're all very comfortable talking about our terms and abbreviations and concepts and ideas, but I do think that things get lost in translation. A good example, I think it came up earlier, is the term conflict of interest. The term conflict, when you translate it into Japanese, has a very negative connotation. And what was happening was, people would say the phrase in English, conflict of interest, and then it gets translated to something equivalent in Japanese, but it meant something very, very negative. It implied that there was somebody was opposing something and that there was a big dispute and so forth. So one of the approaches there is to talk about the term COI, so use the abbreviation, but then express the meaning of COI in Japanese that talks about it in terms of disclosure and so forth. So this came up a few times, that this was often an area of concern with Japanese authors because they didn't like this term, and some of it was simply to do with the fact that the way that the term had been translated and expressed was actually giving a wrong impression. So when some of you may have seen the poster, How to Publish Research, that we produced a few years ago with Liz Wager's help. We decided early on that we would like to get that not just in English, but really make a big effort to get it into a whole range of different languages so that all those different guidelines and all the various parts of the process can really be seen by people and understood by people for whom English isn't their first language, and possibly hadn't seen all of this information in that way before. So this has proved extremely popular. So we have Japanese, Chinese versions, Portuguese for Latin American market, French, and so on. And again, it's getting over this big assumption that everybody's going to be able to absorb all of this information in English and pick up all the nuances and everything in it. I think writing for the audience in local language is immensely helpful. So in terms of what's the overall message here, everybody around the world is driving to develop papers in English. I'm sure many of you have seen this trend that authors in these different regions and so on are increasingly turning to get published in the most prestigious English language journal that they can. However, how, in terms of getting them to understand how to achieve this and how to adopt best practices, I believe that you're better off trying to understand local practices and cultures and, where possible, do things in local language to assist them in that process. So, in a sense, there's a sort of, if you like, an Anglicization development. English is the international language and so on, everybody wanting to publish that way. But they're doing that against a context, a history, a culture, which may have had a different approach to that in the past. And what you've got to be mindful of is that, and work with that to get the message across about how things are done in the international setting.